lot of people have never had money and they don't need money. So we get rejected like that a lot because, you know what? They don't care about that stuff. They don't care about your money.
When they found Frank Fritz dead on his bathroom floor, no one expected what was hiding in his garage, a secret collection worth millions. Inside were over 75 vintage motorcycles, including a one-of-a-kind 1947 Indian Chief prototype valued at $250,000, Aerosmith's long-lost tour van, and even a Star Wars Yoda prototype believed to have been destroyed by George Lucas. But the biggest shock wasn't the physical treasures. It was the handwritten journals he left behind. These reveal the dark truth about his final days, why he was really fired from American Pickers, and who was trying to steal his $6 million fortune. Frank Fritz was born in Davenport, Iowa, in 1963. From an early age, he was different. While other kids rode bikes or traded baseball cards, Frank filled his room with rocks, coins, stamps, and even old beer cans. His parents, Bill and Susan, thought it was a harmless quirk, but to Frank, these forgotten objects had meaning. He once admitted that he used to collect all the staples from school papers, showing just how deep his obsession with overlooked items went. Even his fascination with razor blades, strange as it seemed, hinted at his eye for the unnoticed. Frank attended Sudlow Intermediate and then Bettendorf High School, where he met Mike Wolfe in the 8th grade. The two instantly clicked, spending weekends scouring garage sales and flea markets. They were drawn to the same kind of dusty, forgotten relics that carried hidden stories. While some teachers thought Frank might go far with a traditional education, he didn't agree. College didn't feel like the place for what he truly wanted to learn. For him, knowledge came from touching old things, learning their history, and understanding what made them valuable. After high school, Frank became a fire inspector, covering large regions of Iowa. He remained in that profession for nearly 25 years, but collecting never left him. It only grew. At just 16, he bought a 1964 Harley-Davidson for more than $4,000, a huge sum at the time. His parents were shocked, but to Frank, it wasn't just a motorcycle. It was a piece of history. He worked at places like Quad City Automatic Sprinkler and Coast to Coast Hardware to support his passion, and over time, he built a collection of more than 100 vintage motorcycles. He even built a barn to house them and made regular pilgrimages to the Sturgis Motorcycle Rally in South Dakota, becoming a familiar face in the biker community long before his time on television. What set Frank apart wasn't just what he collected, but how he collected. He had what he called a picker's eye, an uncanny ability to walk into an attic or a barn and spot what others missed. He spent years exploring abandoned places, taking notes, and wondering about the lives of the people who once owned these objects. He wasn't just after the items, he was collecting their stories. This mindset transformed him from a casual collector into someone who treated each find like a historical artifact rescued from obscurity. Even in his job as a fire inspector, Frank's collecting instincts flourished. While inspecting old buildings, he frequently found items left behind, fire helmets, vintage alarms, forgotten gear. To others, these were just remnants. To Frank, they were treasures. His inspections became secret treasure hunts tucked inside fire safety reports. The blend of inspector by day and collector by heart shaped the expert he would later become. His work sharpened his attention to detail. He learned how to read buildings, skills that proved invaluable when scanning antique shops and sheds for hidden gems. He didn't guess. He had a system, a trained eye, and years of experience spotting what others overlooked. That same skill would later shine on American Pickers, where he sifted through piles of junk and consistently found gold. One small moment changed everything. Frank once bought a simple item for $15 and later sold it for $475. It wasn't just a profit that stuck with him. It was a realization that his knowledge had real, tangible value. Years of studying old objects had finally paid off. That one deal lit a fire in him. Collecting was no longer just a hobby. It became a serious business. In 2002, Frank made a bold move. He retired from fire inspection and opened a shop called Frank's Finds in Savannah, Illinois. But this wasn't just any antique store. It was part museum, part-time capsule, filled with firefighting memorabilia, antique tools, and rare oddities that most people had forgotten even existed. The shop was inside an old opera house with a bar, and stepping inside felt like traveling through time. Some visitors found it cluttered and musty, but to Frank, that was a point. It was raw, real, and full of character. It became a magnet for collectors and curious travelers. While some people struggled with the layout, those who truly appreciated Frank's passion understood what made the shop special. That store became the foundation for what came next, television. When TV producers came calling, Frank didn't have to play a part. He just had to be himself, the man who saw treasure where others saw trash, and who believed every object held a story worth telling. While Frank was running his shop, Mike Wolfe was filming his own treasure-hunting adventures. It was around 2002 when Mike began capturing their picking trips on camera. Frank, meanwhile, was content with his store, surrounded by vintage bikes, oil cans, and old toys. He had no plans to leave it behind. But Mike saw something bigger. He believed their road trips could become a TV show and spent months trying to convince Frank to come along. Frank resisted. He liked the stability. The store was his world. Then, something shifted. Frank bought a small fraternal badge for $115. It didn't look like much, but he later sold it for $1,450. The rush, the gambler's high, as Frank called it, was undeniable. That feeling, combined with Mike's persistence, finally tipped the scales. Frank shut his doors, grabbed his gear, and hit the road. Those early road trips, filmed on the fly with no script and no plan, would eventually become the backbone of American Pickers. And with that, Frank Fritz was no longer just a collector. He became a household name. When American Pickers premiered in January 2010, everything changed for Frank Fritz. What began as spontaneous road trips with Mike Wolfe eventually became the raw material that caught the attention of TV producers. Frank transformed from a quiet shop owner into someone watched by millions each week. The first episode pulled in more than 3 million viewers, one of the most successful debuts in the History Channel's history. With his beard, stocky build, and calm demeanor, Frank offered a perfect contrast to Mike's high-energy personality. Fans loved the dynamic between the two. Soon, crowds began gathering at their appearances. In October, when they visited the California Surf Museum, a huge crowd awaited them. Frank, overwhelmed, asked, "What are all these people doing here?" But he stayed and signed autographs until there were none left. Within just 8 months, one of their episodes reached 5.3 million viewers. Frank was officially a star. Their early road trips were unscripted adventures. Driving around in a white Mercedes van, later swapped for a Ford Transit, they had no fixed plan. In September 2011, they passed through southern Maine and discovered Champion Auto in Arundel. Its owner, Mario Burnett, was stunned. He watched the show every week, and now its stars stood in his yard. Frank bought oil cans, signs, and gas station memorabilia, while Mike honed in on motorcycle gear. They spent 5 days exploring, following leads, and meeting locals. That unscripted, authentic approach was part of the magic. Two old friends of van chasing history. Part of what made the show click was how different Mike and Frank were. Mike was tall, thin, and energetic. Frank was shorter, calm, and methodical. Mike went for old motorcycles and Volkswagens, while Frank sought out toys, oil cans, and gas station collectibles. When they picked through Mario's property in Maine, it was clear they complemented each other perfectly. Mike once called Frank a dreamer, sensitive, funny, and thoughtful. Fans agreed. Their odd couple chemistry made the show relatable. Some viewers saw themselves in Frank's careful, deliberate style. Others identified with Mike's quick pace and boldness. Frank's love for motorcycles ran deep. As a teenager, he bought a 1964 Harley-Davidson, his first of many. Over the years, he built a collection of about 35 vintage bikes, storing them in a barn that resembled a museum. His collection included rare Indian motorcycles, such as a 1938 four-cylinder model he found in a Philadelphia barn, and British classics like Vincent, BSA, and Triumph. One of his most prized possessions was a Von Dutch XAVW, a 1942 Harley frame powered by a Volkswagen engine, custom painted by Von Dutch himself. Frank had seen it in a magazine years earlier and was stunned to find it at a yard sale. For Frank, every bike told a story. That's what mattered most. In 2013, Frank decided to share his knowledge by writing How to Pick Vintage Motorcycles. It wasn't a technical manual for experts. It was for anyone who loved bikes or wanted to start collecting. The book was filled with tips, stories, and personal photos. He explained how to spot a good deal, how to negotiate, and what to avoid. His writing style was simple, funny, and straightforward, just like he was on TV. For Frank, the book was a way to pass on everything he'd learned, helping others feel the same joy he felt when bringing an old machine back to life. His time as a fire inspector shaped another collecting passion, firehouse memorabilia. After inspecting buildings for 25 years, Frank had access to places most collectors never saw: abandoned stations, forgotten equipment, outdated alarms. He began collecting it all: brass extinguishers, leather helmets, alarm boxes. On American pickers, his face lit up whenever they stumbled on fire-related items. To Frank, this wasn't just a collecting category. It was personal. What truly set Frank apart was his belief that objects carried stories. He didn't just see a price tag. He saw the history, the people, the culture behind each item. He often spent more time talking to sellers about an item's background than negotiating its price. He especially valued things that showed how Americans used to live: old tools, strange toys, forgotten products. He treated war memorabilia with deep respect, sometimes even donating it to museums when it had ties to fallen soldiers. For Frank, collecting was about preserving stories, not just accumulating stuff. But behind the scenes, Frank fought a battle most fans never saw. He lived with Crohn's disease for over 36 years, a painful, exhausting condition that made everyday life difficult, especially while filming. A close friend said Frank had been dealing with it since his mid-20s. Yet he pushed through the pain, never letting viewers see what he was enduring. Things briefly improved when he quit drinking and focused on getting sober, but the years of stress and illness had taken a toll. In 2017, Frank's personal struggles spilled into public view. Police stopped him for driving on the wrong side of the road. He admitted he had been drinking and had taken Xanax for anxiety. He failed the sobriety test and was charged with operating while intoxicated. Later, he explained that the anxiety came from being constantly watched and judged. He avoided jail time through a plea deal, but the damage to his image was done. It revealed how fame was slowly wearing him down. His relationship with Mike Wolfe also began to unravel. By 2021, Frank revealed they hadn't spoken in 2 years. What hurt most wasn't the work, it was the silence. He'd had back surgery, and Mike never called. Frank said he always felt like the other guy on the show, like being in a band with Steven Tyler, where you're never going to be the front man. When Mike posted a public message about missing Frank, he called it fake and said someone else probably wrote it. He didn't believe Mike had ever said kind words about him in real life. They did finally see each other again in May 2023 during Memorial Day weekend, thanks to a mutual friend. But the pain lingered. During the pandemic, Frank injured his back while moving something at home. He needed surgery, but it was terrible timing. Isolation, the breakup with Mike, and the physical pain led to a spiral. He got hooked on opioids, at first for pain management, but it soon got out of control. Mike later said it was like watching a storm destroy someone. Friends staged interventions and begged him to get help. Frank insisted he was fine, but he wasn't. When the show asked him to take a drug test before returning, he couldn't pass it. That ended his run on American Pickers. His last episode aired in March 2020. At first, fans were told he just needed time off. He even said later, "I never left. I just had back surgery and then COVID hit." But by July 2021, Mike confirmed Frank was not returning. Behind the scenes, Frank had gone through intense surgery, 185 stitches and 2 rods in his spine. He said he was fully healed and eager to come back. But the network had other plans. They didn't bring him back. People close to Frank said the rejection broke him. He felt discarded. From that point on, his health declined rapidly. Frank's life changed forever on July 14, 2022. That morning, a friend found him on the floor of his Iowa farmhouse. He wasn't moving or speaking. The friend called 911, telling dispatchers he might be seizuring. "He can't speak to me." Frank, 59 at the time, had suffered a massive stroke. Doctors rushed him to the hospital, but the damage was severe. He lost much of his ability to move and communicate. After a month in the hospital, he was transferred to a nursing home. But even when he returned home, he needed round-the-clock care. His condition deteriorated. Emergency calls became common, one for pneumonia, other times a complication from Crohn's and COPD. By August 2022, the court stepped in. They ruled that Frank could no longer care for himself. His friend, Chris Davis, was appointed as his guardian, and a bank was put in charge of managing his $6 million estate. Court documents were blunt. Frank couldn't ensure his own food, shelter, or medical care without help. Even with that help, things were difficult. The guardian and bank were regularly reviewed by judges to ensure they were doing their job properly. Frank's medical costs were staggering, over $30,000 a month, adding up to more than $350,000 a year. His only income was around $60,000 from investments, nowhere near enough. He needed 24-hour nursing, special equipment, and therapy. His friend Jerry Jandro said there was even talk of auctioning off Frank's antique collection after his death. "I think he'd do really well with an auction," Jerry said. His fan base would show up in force. As time passed, Frank Fritz's condition continued to deteriorate. His longtime friend Jerry said visiting him became heartbreaking. One entire side of Frank's body no longer functioned. He would try to lift his arm, and it would simply fall back down. Even more painful was knowing that Frank was fully aware of what was happening to him. He couldn't talk the way he used to, couldn't move, and couldn't change any of it. Jerry believed Frank had lost the will to fight. "When people get tired," he said, "they often lose the will to live. I really think he might have lived longer if he hadn't given up." Then came the final call. On September 30th, 2024, Mike Wolfe, Frank's longtime co-star from American Pickers, was told that Frank was fading fast. Mike rushed to his side and stayed with him for an hour, holding his hand, rubbing his chest, and whispering softly. "I told him I wasn't mad at him," Mike later recalled. "I told him I loved him." Just before Frank took his final breath, Mike gave him one last message. "Go find your mom. Just go find her." At 8:50 p.m., Frank Fritz passed away. Mike was there, as was Frank's mother and her best friend, Annette Overbelander. Annette later shared that Mike had never stopped being there for Frank. "He was with him at the end," she said. "That's how they both wanted it." When Frank passed in September 2024, few could have imagined what was hidden behind the doors of his old garage. There, tucked away for years and known only to a handful of close friends, was a stunning collection. More than 75 vintage motorcycles, each with its own story. Some looked showroom new, while others were rusted and waiting for a second chance. The oldest dated back to 1912. Among them were ultra-rare prototypes that experts believe had vanished forever. When news broke, collectors and museums around the globe took notice. Many called it one of the most significant motorcycle discoveries in decades. The details were astonishing. One standout was a 1922 Ace 4 purchased for $45,000 during a memorable American Pickers episode, now valued at nearly $200,000. Another, a 1939 Indian 4 known as the Aristocrat, was worth over $115,000. Frank had pre-war Indian Scouts, including a 1928 model still in its original paint, and 3 Harley-Davidson panheads from the 1950s in various stages of restoration. But the crown jewel was a one-of-a-kind 1947 Indian Chief prototype, a model with no known counterparts. Experts estimated it could be worth more than $250,000. Yet, the motorcycles were only part of what made this collection remarkable. Alongside them were dozens of handwritten journals that Frank had kept for more than 30 years. In them, he recorded everything. Where each motorcycle came from, its previous owners, the parts he had to search for, and the challenges of restoration. Some entries were deeply personal, detailing the emotional satisfaction he felt when a bike roared back to life. These journals turned the machines into stories, and for collectors, that made them priceless. By the time the full inventory was completed, experts estimated the collection's value at over $2 million, with some predicting it could exceed $3 million once auctions began, especially with Frank's name attached. Auction houses scrambled for the rights to the sale, knowing these weren't just old motorcycles. They were relics of American history, curated by a man who genuinely understood their meaning. Frank's fascination with the past wasn't limited to bikes. Among the hidden treasures was a seemingly unremarkable van that turned out to be the original tour van used by Aerosmith during their early days. Frank and Mike had discovered it in the woods of Massachusetts in 2018 and paid $25,000 to restore it. When the band saw it again in 2019, they were amazed. Joe Perry called it amazing, and Ray Tabano, one of Aerosmith's original members, was brought to tears remembering those lean years when the van carried not just equipment, but their dreams. Frank also collected oddities. He once bought a massive taxidermy elephant's head for $9,500, which later ended up in the hands of Jack White from the White Stripes. White traded antiques and cash to acquire it, partly because of his iconic album Elephant. The purchase drew backlash from animal rights activists, but it also showed Frank's boldness in collecting the unusual and the controversial. Among his many unique finds was an original Jell-O wagon from the early 1900s used for advertising across small towns. That, too, eventually made its way into a museum. Frank even dabbled in science fiction collectibles. In one episode of American Pickers, he and Mike stumbled upon 4 early Star Wars Yoda prototypes. They initially looked like fan-made art, but a former Lucasfilm artist confirmed they were authentic, based on 1978 designs and shaped from molds inspired by Albert Einstein. Frank paid well for them, and each ended up being worth more than $6,000. It proved that his passion wasn't confined to motorcycles or Americana. Frank had a broad eye for pop culture and the stories behind it. But just as people were honoring Frank's legacy, a legal battle began. In February 2025, Frank's father, William Bill Fritz, filed a lawsuit claiming the will submitted in 2023 was a forgery. According to Bill, Frank never signed it. The contested document left nearly all of Frank's $6 million estate to friends and caregivers, excluding Bill entirely. Bill argued that he was Frank's only living family and therefore entitled to everything. He demanded a jury trial to settle the matter. The case quickly grew complex. After suffering a major stroke in 2022, Frank had been placed under legal conservatorship. A judge had ruled that Frank was no longer capable of making decisions for himself, a central point in Bill's argument. If Frank wasn't mentally or physically able to care for himself, how could he have legally signed a new will? Bill also claimed he had been pushed away in Frank's final years. He reminisced about their earlier closeness, fishing together in St. Thomas, and said he was unjustly kept out of Frank's life and legacy. Now, it's up to the courts to determine what is true and what isn't. But regardless of how the legal fight unfolds, one thing is already certain. Frank Fritz left behind far more than old motorcycles and quirky antiques. He left a legacy built on passion, history, and a deep love for forgotten things. Through every dusty engine, every journal, every strange collectible, Frank saw something others didn't, a story worth saving. And now, the world is finally seeing those stories for themselves.